Hello, everyone. Welcome. As folks are filtering in, it would be lovely to just see everybody where you're coming from in the chat. I'm coming from a strangely balmy Boston. And I've heard that folks in SF are experiencing some rain lately. So we love to see where everybody is coming from. So please let us know. It's exciting to see the international group of folks that come to these events. So my name is Sarah Getz. I am the Collections Programming Manager and Data Associate here at Letterform Archive. I run these series, and while we're waiting for folks to filter in a bit, I'm going to be sharing just a few little details about, well, not details, big overviews of some of the upcoming opportunities and programs here at Letterform Archive. So first up, starting this weekend, is an online workshop that looks really cool for those of us in chilly places, typographic knitting, writing with wool. This is an exploration of basic type knitting techniques and a fun spot to plan your next holiday knitting project using Knit Grotesque and other custom handwritten fonts. That is with Rudiger Schlomer. Lovely to see people coming in from so many places. Hi from Toronto, Brazil. So exciting. The next is really highlighting all of the different places that people are coming from. This is our first public event hosted and created by our very global docent cohort. This group of 16 people speak a total of 14 different languages and are from at least 8 different countries. So it's a really exciting opportunity to see what kinds of favorite objects folks have who are coming from all over. So come check out next Tuesday as the docent cohort talks about some of their favorite things in the archive under the headings of lettering, typography, and visual language. So next, if you are in the Bay Area, this one's for you. This is Subscription to Mischief, which is our current exhibition on lettering in graffiti in graffiti zines of the 90s, is hosting in-person research visits. That means that you get to see some material that didn't make it into the show, and you get to handle things yourselves, which is very exciting. And those are hosted by 2 of the 4 curators of that exhibition. So that's 2 Thursdays from now. All right, and then into December, we've got some workshops going on. This is, make your own paper gems. So make paper creations using old publications, your old publications and ours, to take you through the process of creating unique and handmade holiday gifts using just a few tools and recycled papers and parts, but with Dorothy Yuki. All right, I'm just going to stick a few links from these things that I just mentioned. And then one of our favorite times of year is our rare book sale at the archive. So this includes a treasure trove of really rare duplicates from the collection from 19th and 20th century type specimens and hard to find design books and periodicals. So for all you all type nerds, this is both online and on site. And if you are a member with Letterform Archive, which you should be, you get early access to pick the best ones. So join us on Saturday, December 9th for that, both online and in person. And then one of our final events of the year is From Gutenberg to the Gallery, 5 Decades of Print and Book Arts with Harry Reese, who was the 2023 Lieberman Lecturer. This is hybrid, so if you're in person or online, please join us. It should be pretty exciting. So if you want to know anything more about any of these events, just check them out at letarc.org/events. You could also check out letarc.org/join to find out more about really cool membership perks. We're actually launching a whole bunch of cool new programming for members in the new year. So check us out. I'm going to turn it over to Lucy Parker, who is the publisher for A Letter from Archive Books, to introduce a little bit about what's going on with publishing and this salon. So Lucy made her first book when she was 3 years old, and 200 plus titles later, she shows no sign of letting up. With nearly 15 years experience crafting best-selling books for trade-in gift markets, Lucy specializes in producing high-end, design-driven books, often in collaborations with museums, such as the Exploratorium and the Walt Disney Family Museum, and magazines such as Popular Science. Lucy was formerly a senior editor at Weldon Owen Publishing, where she developed more than 20 art, lifestyle, and technology titles a year. So please, Lucy, take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. I didn't realize you're going to read my copious bio. I appreciate all the setup there. I want to welcome everyone to this really exciting day for the publishing team and for Letter from Archive in general. We're really excited to offer a forum here for our collaborators for this book, this big, beautiful beauty, Die Fläche, which is the first in our facsimile series. We are really excited to be producing a whole line of projects that allow you, our community, to get closer to rare and wonderful objects in the collection, reproduced in kind of stunning detail and supported with wonderful editorial and original art and lovely design, and of course the wisdom of folks like we have here in the room. So our next title in the facsimile series comes out next fall. It is on Pizza and KF, which is very exciting. And if you're interested in any of our really current offerings, yesterday we just opened the member pre-order window for The Complete Commercial Artist, our book on on a Japanese design periodical from the 1920s. So if you're interested in that, please check it out. We, I think, have a few more days left on our pre-order window, so you can get that at a really nice discount for the holidays. Die Fläche, this book that I showed earlier, has a whole team behind it. It has design by Marissa Queck and Alice Chow. It has managing editorial support by Molly Stewart. It has original lettering from Julian Priez. It has digitization by April Harper. And it has really wonderful color work by Tom Bollier. But I also wanted just to take this beat to introduce you to Chris Westcott, the book's editor, who is going to be sort of moderating this session today. And Chris did a really beautiful job of shaping and supporting this story and working with the folks you see here. So thank you, Chris, for helping us make this thing happen. And very excited to hear all of you guys chat about it in more detail.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, I was stuck on mute for a second there. Yeah, I'm really excited about this event today. I've learned so much from these authors, and I'm excited for you to hear about their essays for this book, Die Fläche. I wanted to talk a little bit about the book before we started, and then I'll give some short introductions to the contributors, essay contributors to the book, and let them speak a little bit about their essays, then offer some questions to get some conversation started. And we'd really love to have everyone in attendance ask questions as well. So there's a Q&A feature in the Zoom chat. I guess it's not the chat, but Q&A. And so encourage you to drop all of your questions in there. Sarah will help us collect those questions and bring them to the contributors. So Die Fläche is a design publication, at least that's what we're calling it, from circa 1902 to 1911, produced in Vienna by leading lights of the Secession, the Wiener Werkstätte and Associates. As Lucy kind of showed you in a second ago, it's quite a large book and quite a spectacular production. So our facsimile is 320 pages of full color reproductions, plus these critical essays, rich critical essays. And here you're seeing on the screen one of the reproductions from inside of the facsimile. The second volume of Die Fläche, this production that you'll be hearing more about shortly, featured not simply two-fold pages, but four-fold fold-out pages. And because this is a facsimile, we felt the need to recreate that too. So here's an image of one of those fold-outs in its full glory. And this morning I was out walking and thinking about how recently the design critics Stephen Heller had an article about the heavy books that are being produced in the design world since COVID started, and called out one of our other books. And yeah, regretfully, this is also a heavy book, but it kind of has to be because of its original source material. And so, yeah, just to give you a sense of its size and magnificence, I did a quick measurement, and the wingspan of this book, fully unfurled, is something close to that of an osprey. It's about 66 inches. So there's really, yeah, quite a lot to see in this kind of spectacular book. So yeah, with no further ado, from me, I'd love to introduce our panelists today. And I'll introduce all three of them. I'll start with Diane Silverthorne, the first author in the book, and proceed through all three, and then have them speak a little bit about the book. So yeah, Diane Silverthorne's essay opens the volume with a brilliant exploration of the leading lights of Vienna design and their context. Also does a deep dive into the circumstances around the making of Die Fläche and takes a close look at some of its contexts and themes. Diane is an art historian and Vienna 1900 scholar whose research examines European art and design in the long 19th century into the 20th century. She has a passion for music and its impact in the visual arts, and has published widely on these subjects, giving particular attention to Alfred Rohler, a Secession graphic artist and opera designer, and also one of the lead editors of Die Fläche Volume 1. Diane has lectured for many years at the University of London and for public audiences, recently speaking at the Freud Museum in London. Her anthology, Music, Art, and Performance from Liszt to Riot Girl, I love that title, was published by Bloomsbury in 2018. Recently, she's written on the life and art of Anna Mahler, daughter of Gustav and Alma Mahler, for a special issue of Sculpture Journal. And I hear that she does a really excellent impersonation of the young Alma Mahler from her early diaries. However, Diane told me today that her voice is a little rough for a throat infection. So she asked that we sort of bear with her in case she starts to lose her voice. It's the evening over there in London, so maybe you can get that impression. Next, I want to introduce Dan Reynolds, who writes about the lettering of the Vienna Secession, and in particular, the influential, yet today, here in the US at least, little-known lettering theorist and educator, Rudolf von Larisch. Dan is an American designer living in Germany. He teaches typography at the Niederrhein University of Applied Sciences in Krefeld. After a short time studying at the Offenbach University of Art and Design, just 2 blocks from the Klingsborg Museum, Dan began working as a type designer at Linotype and Monotype. From 2012 until 2018, he undertook doctoral studies at the Braunschweig University of Art. And since then, Dan has devoted himself to researching type foundries active in Germany's long imperial era from 1871 to 1914. After graduating, he started working on a database to document all the sans serif typefaces sold in Germany during the 19th century. In 2020-2021, Dan was scientific advisor for a project funded by the Berlin City State to digitize more than 400 type specimens in public collections and make them freely available online for viewing and use. Dan is also the person who I come across almost on a daily basis as I'm researching future projects for publication, especially those relating to typefaces. If there's a typeface that was created in the late 19th, early 20th century, probably Dan has had something to say about it and really broken the archives open for us all. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Megan Brandow-Faller, who will speak about her essay on the women artists of Die Fläche, whose feminist ideas and practices played a really vital role in art and design of their times. Megan is a professor of history at the City University of New York in Kingsborough, and also teaches at the CUNY Graduate Center. Her research focuses on art and design in Secessionist and interwar Vienna, including children's art and the artistic toys of the Vienna Secession, the expressionist ceramics of the Wiener Werkstätte, folk art and modernism, and women's education. She is an editor of the book Childhood by Design, Toys and the Material Culture of Childhood, 1700 to Present. She's author of The Female Secession, Art and Decorative Decoration in Vienna Women's Academy, and the co-editor with Laura Morowitz of Erasures and Eradications in Modern Viennese Art, Architecture, and Design, which was released just last year. She also contributed 2 catalog essays for the 2021 exhibition, The Women of the Wiener Werkstätte in Vienna's Museum of Applied Arts. Her newest project focuses on the dissemination and popularization of secessionist ideas about child creativity in post-war American art. It's a fascinating topic. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about that perhaps today. We're probably going to talk a lot about child art in this conversation. So yeah, those are our panelists. I'm very excited to hear from them now. And Diane, would you like to start us off with a little bit about your essay?
Sure, yes, thanks very much for that introduction, Chris. And I'd personally like to say hello to the amazing spread of people that seem to have come from practically all over the world, and also to say hi to Megan and Dan, who I haven't met before, Megan, who I kind of have met transatlantically in our sort of Vienna research studies. So I think before I kind of dive into the actual article, I did just want to say that I was quite amazed to get the contact initially from Chris to write for this extraordinary publication, because I had I had done a huge amount of research for my doctoral thesis on this strange form of graphic design called Flächenkunst, or surface art. I have to say, so it was one of the major chapters of my dissertation. My avatar, so to speak, as Chris briefly mentioned, was the figure Alfred Roller, who was a founder of the Vienna Secession. He's rather a kind of behind the scenes kind of a guy. He's certainly not one of the most notable or not best known, if you like, of the secession founders, but he was an editor of Ver Sacrum. You can see the first cover here, which he in fact designed, and he did contribute quite a lot in the graphic arts area, and also in posters. And I used him to look at 3 areas, if you like, or 3 spaces of art, one of which was the graphic arts. And as I mentioned, and as I say in my article in the introduction, when I first started my research in Vienna, looking at this kind of area of graphic arts, I was quite literally, I'd never really explored the graphic arts in detail before, but I determined initially to try and work through the kind of techniques and design stories, if you like, that were being told through Ver Sacrum, and ended up in the archives at the MAC Museum, which is the Applied Arts Museum in Vienna, which has the archives of the Vienna Secession, works on paper, as well as the Wiener Werkstätte. And as I say in the introduction to my article, the curator took me down to the vaults, opened these huge drawers, these flat drawers, which some of you who understand the graphic arts will understand, pulled out these first run posters, which were all beautifully sort of layered with paper, and sort of drew back the paper, and he very proudly said, "This is one of Alfred Roller's posters." And he was a progenitor. He was a leader in an art form called Flächenkunst, and I just became very fascinated in this extraordinary art form, which I'd never heard of before. So one of 3 or 4 chapters in my dissertation was devoted to exploring what this art form was all about. So that in part is what my chapter is about. And it was also quite interesting to try and find the words, if you like, that in order to kind of explain what Flächenkunst meant, not only to the secession, who were essentially sort of fighting in a way for a kind of their voice in modernity and modernism in the modern art world, in competition in some respects with Paris, for example, but who were also searching for what was uniquely an Austrian art, something that they could say represented Austria as a kind of an Austrian form of modernism. So my chapter really scans quite well 3 or 4 in depth, 3 or 4 sort of areas. So I look in detail at the atmosphere and the activities and this extraordinary explosion in modern art, but in all aspects of arts, in music and art, in literature and sciences, this extraordinary intense period from about 1890 to 1910 in Vienna. And I give some kind of context for that, both this extraordinary explosion of new modernist forms of art in all the various different art forms, but also the underlying tensions that exemplified the issues in the last years, if you like, of the Habsburg Empire, the final emperor of the Habsburg Empire, which had lasted 400 years and which, of course, collapsed in the First World War, as we're sort of nearing, if you like, this sort of dramatic sort of demise of the Habsburg Empire. So I look at that kind of context. I also looked at the extraordinary explosion of debates in Vienna, but also drawing on other graphic art forms sort of across Europe. These extraordinarily and very intense debates about ornament and design, and what those various different sorts of complementary and different views on what design represented, and how, in a sense, the sort of arguments around design, which were happening in a very intense period in sort of in opposition, for example, to historicism, which very much exemplified what the secession was about, and then the kind of critical debates against the secession for even greater sort of reduction in the kind of ornamental notion. And underlying all of these extraordinary debates which centered on Vienna, the emergence of a kind of, if one wants to use the more general term, Art Nouveau style in Vienna, which became very, very different from that which people might be more familiar with if they look at the Art Nouveau kind of organic style, if you like, of Paris. So yeah, that was the deep dive really that I was doing. And then ultimately the sort of 4th part of my chapter attempted, as I did when I analysed Versacrum and also published articles on Versacrum and its place, if you like, in that huge explosion of little magazines and art periodicals that were published across Europe at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. I also did a kind of a dive into Die Fläche in order to kind of try and understand what were the underlying drives that produced this publication. And just one more thing that I would add at the moment, which is there was this extraordinarily close relationship between the founders of the secession, so obviously Alfred Roller, Joseph Hoffmann, Koloman Moser, the sort of, if you like, the driving figures who were also excellent in the graphic arts. The way in which they then sort of invaded, if you like, the Applied Arts School and became professors there, all in the same period, 5 to 10 years. And the students of the Applied Arts School, and this explosion which led to the publication of this extraordinarily unique periodical, Die Fläche, which is less well known, much less well known than Versacrum, but shows this extraordinary melting pot of the kind of design styles that were exploding, and in a sense precursors to the emergence of the professional graphic design world that then followed in the 20th century. I think I should stop there for a moment. Actually, do you want to pass on to the next slide? Because what we have here, I will just speak. Sorry, could you go back just a minute, Chris?
Mm-hmm.
And then, so I mentioned this Versacrum, which is the first cover of Versacrum, and there's all sorts of stories that have been sort of told about this particular cover designed by Alfred Roller. To us, of course, looking at it now, it looks quite mild, and it certainly doesn't look particularly revolutionary, but it has often been interpreted as the way in which the secession demonstrated that they were sort of a new spring, if you like, breaking away from the historicism and the sort of conservatism that existed in Vienna in the art world. And you know, this is this little tree blooming and breaking the bounds of its enclosure. But perhaps more importantly for our purposes, we can see the first cover of Die Fläche, which integrated many of the principles which Versacrum had kind of led on initially, which is the integration of the typeface, the visuals, and the kind of masthead, if you like, in a way that created a sort of unified cover, a unified sort of work of art, where the kind of information was as much a part of the design as were the visuals. And if you want to just move on one more slide, this, in a sense, again, we're kind of also moving in the same period, but this is a photograph from the exhibition that was launched by or designed and launched by the founders of the secession, who then left the secession, founded the Wiener Werkstätte, and created this extraordinary art show in Vienna, which attracted thousands of people. And what's so fascinating about this photograph is it shows and demonstrates how important the graphic arts were to this sense of a new art that was uniquely Austrian. This whole room was devoted to these brilliantly dynamic posters, which were sort of exemplified the new styles of the Wiener Werkstätte. And I think both Megan and I probably picked up on these. Again, I did, as I said, I tried to do a deep dive into Die Fläche to pull out some of the themes. And what fascinated me about these extraordinary illustrations that were very much the product of the students at the Kunstgewerbeschule, the Applied Arts School, which incidentally was it gave more opportunities, to female students as well as male students. And every now and again, when I was looking through the visuals, there were certain things that kind of rose to the surface of these very many different styles, which sort of this melting pot of styles, which Die Fläche kind of exemplifies. But these really struck me. It looked like someone had or one of the professors had set a kind of classroom project and asked the students to create posters to promote the modern city of Vienna. And what these posters show is a huge leap away from what we think about as the kind of Art Nouveau Parisian advertising poster, with their kind of organicist designs and these kind of beautiful sort of nymph-like women. And what we see emerging here in these posters are a series of women that look much more independent. We see a modern world emerging, yeah, I think these graphic designs really were, I think, very much ahead of their time.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Diane.
Okay.
All right, Dan.
All right. Thank you very much. So I'm here, as Chris already said in the introduction, to talk about Rudolf von Larisch and a bit of how he intersected with the secession, as you can see in the pages of Die Fläche. So I have on this slide, the three images don't come from Die Fläche, but I wanted to use them to introduce Larisch's oeuvre, even though the image on the left one, Alfred Roller, wasn't made by Larisch himself. So Larisch comes onto the lettering scene in Vienna, at least in public, in 1899. He must have known many of the secessionists before that point. But at this time, he was in his early 40s, and he had been working as an archivist within the imperial administration. So he had spent a lot of time with records from the Habsburg family. And he also spent time with records from the Order of the Golden Fleece, which was the chivalric society. I guess it's probably similar somewhat to the Order of the Garter in England, at least in the grand scheme of things. And so he worked with historical manuscripts on a regular basis. And by historical, what we're talking about is centuries before the 1890s. So things going back into the Middle Ages. And this seems to me to be how he discovered lettering for himself. And it makes him similar to many other figures from the international lettering reform movement at the beginning of the 20th century, like Edward Johnston in London and Delitzsch in Leipzig. All three of these individuals came to lettering first by consulting manuscripts from the distant past. I mean, Johnston was looking at things from the 10th century, for instance. And he didn't create work or have his students create work that was historicist in the sense that they were creating documents in the style of 16th century court hands. Instead, he taught his students to focus on the act of writing itself and to optimize writing in an ornamental way. So the example on the left, it isn't from Larisch, from Roller, but it's written with a kind of writing instrument that Larisch popularized, which he called a Quellstift. That's something like an origin pen. And initially, the students made them out of cork. And it gives you a monolinear line without stroke contrast, and the thickness of the line doesn't change based on the direction of the stroke of the pen. So like a broad pen, the angle you move it in determines how thick or thin the stroke is. With a pointed pen, the pressure that you put on the writing instrument makes the line thicker or thinner. Here, a line is being scratched almost onto the surface. And if you look through the first volume of the Fläche, you'll see all sorts of things, literally from the cover and the title page onward, that are written with a Quellstift, or look like they were written by a Quellstift in some cases, and are not based on historical writing form, letter form styles. Another kind of Larischian way of lettering is to, I have to ask him for forgiveness for this simplification, but to take sans serif capital letters and put them within rules. So either very thick rules between the lines of text, as you can see on his bookplate, in the middle, or thin lines, like you can see on this design for a First World War memorial. And you see a lot of this sort of all caps block style sans serif lettering between thick rules in the shorter second volume of Die Fläche. You see it in some of the advertising for the Kunstschau that happened in 1948. And it's a style that, like the Quellschrift, is taken up by a lot of other letterers working outside of Austria. Okay, you can finally move to the next slide. Thank you, Chris. So here's another item with Quellstift style lettering, which was not made by Larisch himself, but is from Coleman Moser. And I assumed that already in 1899 that Moser and Larisch knew each other. Larisch didn't start teaching at the Applied Arts School in Vienna until 1902, but he had been taking painting lessons in the 1890s, so already at an age that was older than your normal student would have been. And I assume that at the latest, at that sort of activity, that he must have gotten into contact with his later colleagues from the secession at the school. And even though this isn't from Larisch himself, and even though not all of the letters appear directly written, because we have this knocked out, essentially, text at the top, and with where you can see the paper coming through the red ink elsewhere. This was another technique that Larisch had his students make to prepare them to think about making three-dimensional inscriptions. So there's images of it in the book, but one of the exercises that he recommended students take up after they had gotten used to writing ornamental lettering by hand over longer passages, that they could then, for instance, hammer those letter forms into thin sheets of metal to create three-dimensional letters that still retain this idea of scratching the letter form into the surface. And that sort of effect is approximated in a lot of his students' work, and also in other examples from the secession, like this poster. Okay, so I'll move on to the next slide. Something that I think is important when thinking about Larisch and many of the other members, they're not all of the same actual generation, but this initial group of figures in Central Europe teaching lettering at the beginning of the 20th century, that lettering was something that every student attending these schools tended to have to take. At some schools, they were part of like it's a bit of an anachronism. But we have these foundation years in art education today. The Bauhaus had a 4-course, which is what many foundation years are sort of referencing in their curricula. And these sort of initial level courses at schools in the early 20th century often included lettering. So for instance, in Offenbach, every student who attended the Applied Arts School had class with Rudolf Koch. Some of them would later specialize in lettering and type design, but many more of the students who had been in his general classes would brag later in life that they had been Koch's students. Also early in the 20th century, around the time that Larisch began teaching at the Applied Arts School in 1902. Lettering and typography were not subjects that were part of your typical art training curriculum, or which were taught at art academies. Those were areas in those were activities in the 19th century which were still within the realm of the respective trades of sign painting, lithography, and printing, and the training of apprentices for a long time was something that happened within firms themselves, depending on the jurisdiction, maybe also on trade schools that had lower status than these applied arts schools. So this idea of teaching lettering at an academy like the ones in Vienna or London or Offenbach, Düsseldorf, the Art Academy in Leipzig, etc., which all starts at the beginning of the 20th century or the very end of the 19th century, is something which represents people who weren't part of the printing and sign making trades coming in to them. All right, so all of the students, I believe, certainly in certain years, had to go through Larisch's instruction at the academy, and one of those students was Oskar Koschka. And at the Klingspor Museum in Offenbach, there are 3 or 4 sheets like this one that Koschka wrote out. Here you can also see that the lines of text are sort of captured inside this grid system almost of rules between lines. And I mentioned before that Larisch encouraged his students to write, to simply start writing, to sit in front of the page and to write a text, and then to look at it and, you know, analyze it, and then to write again, and to be able to eventually lend an ornamental appearance to all of their text. That if you could start with just everyday writing, that this would have an effect in all of the arts and applied arts work that they would make in the future. You know, he thought that young pupils in schools should do this. And he didn't recommend consulting models of penmanship or specific historical templates, but they should find the style within themselves and their own practice of writing. This kind of exercise where you write tightly packed together lines of all caps, sans serif text between heavy rules, you often don't find things like this in design education, because this is not legible in the way that we often, especially in type design, discuss legibility. I think that Larisch would have been quite happy in the early 1990s with discussions about reading and legibility, because already 100 years before or 90 years before, he had said that people would read a text. If, you know, if they wanted to, they would be able to read it. And we should be able to trust them that they can actually do this. All right, so I'll go on to the next slide. The initial training of writing was to be able to create Flächenkunst, where lettering played an intrinsic part and was well integrated into the entire image and made the entire image better. He came on to the lettering scene in 1899 because, in his opinion, so much lettering in advertising and on buildings in Vienna was terrible, and that the craftsmen who were making these inscriptions and advertisements had lost the sense of proportion that's necessary for good lettering. I mean, Larisch was a person who lived in the past, but of course he knew things that type designers today all take for granted, like that this white space inside letters and between letters is just important to the effect of a text as the strokes. And he wanted people to pay attention to that, and sort of his frustration at lettering in Vienna drove him to positively change things. So students at the Applied Arts School, also in other teachers' classes like Cheska's, for instance, would make books like this one that you can see from Die Fläche. And this is kind of exactly the sort of lettering that I think Larisch hoped his students would make at the academy. You can see this sort of simple, expressive letter form that fits into the rest of the composition. And this is a block book. It was printed in a series, and you know, the visceral quality of the letter forms, and they were cut out of something, just as the illustration was cut out of something. I think that this was his intended next step once people had mastered writing. All right, I think I have one more project with 2 images. Okay, so this, especially if you look on the left side of this, you can see that there's that's the cover of this Leporello book, and the negative space has been cut out of a sheet of metal. And there's another similar piece for the back cover, which sort of holds this Leporello together as a closed object. And here you can also see sans serif letters between rules, also very expressive letter forms that don't look like, I mean, you can always find relationships with commercial typefaces from the time, but generally speaking, these aren't typographic copies. And this is much later in time. This was probably written in the 1920s. And this was written by Hertha Ramsauer, who became Larisch's second wife, and who, after he died in 1934, continued his teaching at various schools in Vienna. And this object, for instance, just like the 2 that I showed before, is at the Klingspor Museum in Offenbach, because the museum mounted an exhibition of work from the Larisches and their students back when Hertha Larisch was still alive. And the materials from that exhibition were donated to the museum and can be seen today. So I have one more slide, if you could switch to it. One thing that's interesting about Hertha Larisch Ramsauer is that, unlike Rudolf von Larisch, she was very interested in writing letter forms that were rooted in the past. So here you can see this looks like a mix of uncial and vaguely Lombardic capital forms, maybe. It's a lot like some of the calligraphy from the Lord of the Rings films. And she also, it's not pictured here, you can see some images in the book. She was a strong proponent of blackletter, which Rudolf von Larisch himself, when he burst onto the scene at Vienna at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, was vehemently against, because he found it just too unlegible, too illegible. even though, of course, he could read it just as easily as he could read Roman type. This might come up in the discussions, but Larisch wrote a handbook. The first edition came out in 1905, and it was republished in 10 additional editions. And with each additional edition of the book, more historical reference material comes in. There isn't any in the first edition. Some of this is the influence of Edward Johnston, who kind of offered a competing school of lettering instruction. And some of it is from his students, who generally seem to have been a bit more broad in their letter interests. And some of it, especially in his last 15, 20 years, is probably Hertha Ramsauer, because he even brings various black letter styles into his reference material. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dan. It's really fascinating. All right. Megan, you're ready?
Hi. Well, I would echo everyone in thanking Chris and everyone for the invitation. This has been an absolute jewel box of a publication to be involved in. That's the best way to put it. I mean, rarely as an art historian are you given the opportunity, you know, to say, hey, whatever images you need, we'll get them and we'll do the permissions. Die Fläche is something that has come across my radar many times. I've included it in the female secession, but it was really delightful to have the chance to devote a standalone article to it. And of course, I love the focus of this publication and that it is very academically rigorous, but also accessible. So my article talks about the female contributors to Die Fläche and generally the idea of women artists in the circles of the Vienna Secession and Klimt group. So women were not allowed to be members of the big three exhibition leagues in Vienna, the Secession, the Hagenbund, the so-called Artist Guild, until after World War II. But surprisingly or not surprisingly, the Klimt group did devote unusual energy to supporting younger talents, and among them, women. Some of them have become a sort of stars of Vienna 1900. For instance, Fanny Haflinger-Zatsuka, she's quite well known now, thanks to perhaps my work and others. And some of these female artists in graphic design only worked for a relatively short amount of time. They were subject to typical pressures of marriage and child-rearing and remain sadly unknown until right now. So one great thing about this publication is that I did have the chance to work on some who have not gotten as much attention as others in the recent years. Fanny Haflinger-Zatsuka is one of the best-known artists who was included in Die Fläche among the women. She was a contemporary of Schiele and Kokoschka. Her work was included at the 1908 Kunstschau exhibition. That exhibition, the high point of Viennese art, architecture, and design, was an exhibition in which 2/3 of the participants were female, largely because of the way in which the Wiener Werkstätte and the Klimt group embraced the applied arts. So Haflinger was likened to a female Hofmann, Joseph Hoffmann, in that her talents were very diverse. She embodied the type of the Tausendkünstler or sort of Renaissance artist who practiced painting, furniture design, architecture, graphic printmaking all together. And you can see this wonderful example of Flächenkunst that graced the pages of Die Fläche. It's a scene of Schönbrunn, and it's reduced to these very basic geometrical shapes and this strong decorative rhythm. She was a feminist artist. She founded a radical feminist collective in 1926 called the Wiener Frauenkunst. So she was definitely an artist that was mentored by the leaders of the Klimt group, and had a very distinguished exhibition career. So again, the artists of the Klimt group did include women artists in many of its important ventures, like the 1908 Kunstschau exhibition. They included special issues of the better-known publication Versachum, including the work of Fanny Harflinger and her classmates. The women were designers for the 1908 Emperor Homage Parade, and so on and so forth. So one of the themes in the article is that female art students in Vienna 1900 were looked at by their male professors as a source of untapped freshness and vitality and expressivity in a similar manners as the quote-unquote primitive peoples of Oceania, Africa, and or the folk artist of Eastern Europe within the borders of the Habsburg Empire. So you see this sort of freshness and vitality, conveyed by this image by Elsa Lott, one of the lesser known artists who contributed to this periodical there. And as my colleague Dan already mentioned, it was not an uncommon phenomenon for the male secessionist professors to marry their female students, looked at as these, as a sort of domestic primitive. In a positive way. They were looked at precisely because they were isolated from male academic institutions. And I'm happy to talk about the question about the Kunstgewerbeschule, the School of Applied Arts, later. So Chris, if you could advance the slide, that would be great. So one thing interesting about the female art students in Die Fläche is that they are moving towards this purely surface-bound form of art, this particularly Viennese notion of Flächenkunst, which could be translated as surface decoration. And one source that they had in their experimentations was the aesthetics of untutored children's drawings, as you see here. One of the most important figures that I work on was a member of the Vienna Secession named Franz Cizek. He was a member of the Klimt group. He was a co-organizer of the 1908 Kunstschau exhibition, and he is renowned as the quote-unquote discoverer of untutored children's drawings. He originally was a student at the Conservative Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. He wanted to be a painter, and he rented rooms from a carpenter. The carpenter's children invaded his rented space, and basically he became fascinated by the children's scribbles and drawings that they did on a big board that he had in his room. And he eventually decided that the children had more to teach him than his academy professors. So he began teaching children informally at first. And then from 1903, 1904 onwards, his world-renowned youth art classes were attached to the Progressive School of Applied Arts. It was part and parcel of the broader secessionist reforms sweeping the institution. So what is interesting is that the women artists of Vienna 1900, many of them, not all, emulated the aesthetics of children's drawings in their work as a sort of parallel, sort of primatizing influence as folk art and or the arts of East Asia as a source for the radical simplification, the radical flatness you see in the pages of Die Fläche. So this was an example of work by one of Cizek's students, and Cizek himself openly compared children's art to the art of the ancient Egyptians, to the art of African tribes, or to the early Italian masters, for instance. So children's art was one of the many sources that women artists used in this radically simplified visual language. If we can keep advancing, that would be amazing. The results in Die Fläche were stunning. So here's an example of Marie Serenius, who was an example of an artist who continued her training at the Bauhaus. But it's a wonderful example of Viennese Flächenkunst, surface art. The stencil was one technique that was rediscovered by secessionist design educators So at the time in the 19th century, stenciling was viewed as a purely mechanical medium, used to reproduce designs for wallpaper. But many secessionist educators rediscovered the stencil, precisely because of the flatness and simplification inherent in the technique. And you can see the strikingly modernist qualities of this image. Cyrenius was also an artist who studied in Cizek's courses for adults. So you can very much look at Cizek as a contemporary of Johannes Itten in the way he taught his better known introductory course or Vorkurs at the Bauhaus. In that Cizek also led experimental art courses for adults. They were called the Ornamental Studies course at the School of Applied Arts, and essentially he encouraged students to give expression to abstract emotions, mental states through ornamental forms, and in general, the course and movement synthesized developments in Expressionism, Cubism, and tried to visualize the sensation of movement. So if you advance on, I think we have. So here's another example of how Viennese Flächenkunst really was a premonition of the abstract. So oftentimes Viennese modernism, is not looked at in terms of abstraction. And, we think of the predominance of the figure in, for instance, the work of Gustav Klimt. If you look at the applied arts works like this, I would argue tell another story. So I prefer to keep my remarks brief to leave room for Q&A.
Okay, thank you. That's wonderful. Great. Yeah, so we have about a half hour. We have a hard out at 1:30 our time. Yeah, I'm happy to start collecting some questions. I see there are a couple in the Q&As, but I'm sure there are more that are brewing after those really wonderful presentations of these chapters. And yeah, I will stop sharing my screen so you can see everyone. Hi. All right, so yeah, there's so much overlap and sort of conversation already happening in these essays. One thing that I was really delighted to see in all three of these essays was this term Flächenkunst, which is a totally kind of unprecedented term for a lot of English speakers here in the US, and kind of coming to the fore. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about what was behind the interest in sort of articulating, what were they trying to articulate in presenting this term as distinct from design or a certain kind of craft or ornamentation, if it is distinct from those things? What was happening in Vienna that gave rise to this kind of ferment around Flächenkunst?
Do you want me to speak?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I know we've all approached this from different angles. When I was looking at this term, which essentially was given to me right at the beginning of my research all those years ago, I foraged around, if you like, to try and find its origins, and the Vienna Secessionists originally, their fascination with this idea of using the graphic arts as the kind of mode through which they differentiated themselves from Art Nouveau and other styles of that nature in different areas of Europe. There were two or three things that seemed to happen at the same time. One tiny small thing which kind of gave a clue was an exhibition, a secession exhibition in 1899, which featured the work of a not very well-known artist, a Leipzig artist called Max Klinger, who was in fact a brilliant graphic artist, if one could use the modern term for them. But he wrote one treatise called Malerei und Zeichnung, painting and drawing, and he wrote about in this, which was cited in the exhibition catalogue. So for every exhibition in the Secession House, the Secessionist created not what we would describe as a catalogue with lots of visuals, but a kind of map of the actual exhibition, how you needed to go around it, which was also revolutionary at the time. But also they quoted from his treatise at this particular exhibition of drawings, and talked about, his treatise talks about the importance of distinguishing between painting and drawing, which seems to us to be very obvious. And he emphasized in his text the importance of the surface. It is the surface that you see in the drawing that makes drawing different from painting. Again, we're talking loosely about a translation from a quite complex German text, but there was that sort of, it's as if they were looking for, as I say, a way of differentiating their form of modernism from what was happening in other European cultural centers. And then I think various things came together, really. Diane has already mentioned that von Larisch, although he was not strictly speaking a secessionist, in fact, I don't think he joined the secessionist stuff as such, but between about 1899 and the early 1900s, when there was this sort of extraordinary shift between the secessionists who were fascinated by the graphic arts, particularly, for example, Koloman Moser, Alfred Roller, and one or two other of the designers, shifted their sort of emphasis. Well, they were very busy, actually, because they were still very busy leading the secession, into the Kunstgewerbeschule. They aligned themselves also with Larisch's, please correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, but von Larisch's unique way of seeing lettering as this kind of surface art, literally the sort of rhythmic intention of the lettering as each letter walks across the page, if you like, and this sense of an integrated lettering, graphic design, flatness, if you like, the sort of negative positive effect of a lot of their art forms, which we've also seen in what Megan has just shown from those extraordinary images, very modern images of the female students created, female artists. And that this seemed to just come together. And then commentators started to remark on the fact, those that followed the secession, those that followed the work of the Kunstgewerbeschule, started to kind of use this term, Flächenkunst, to big up, I suppose you could say, the unique difference between the kind of geometricized, abstracted forms that the secession were using, as opposed to what was going on in other urban centers in terms of Art Nouveau. So there was this kind of interesting dynamic. And I suppose what you could also say is that, you know, these extraordinary, intense and sudden changes between what was happening in Vienna and what was happening in other cities, there was this extraordinary 10-year period where there were sort of breakthroughs into new ways of doing things, that were partly led by the very close collaboration between the art forms as a whole. So there was no differentiation in a sense. There was, or at least much less hierarchy between the graphic arts, painting and sculpture altogether. So there was much more of a focus of kind of all artists being skilled and sort of brilliant in all of these different forms of art. And that was also in part underpinned by another German term, which you asked me to explain, I think, in the article, the Gesamtkunstwerk, this German term which floated in from Richard Wagnerian ideas. But this notion of the unified artwork was transposed into the visual arts very dramatically through the Secessionists and at the Kunstgewerbeschule and in Die Fläche as well as in Versacrum, as a kind of unified form of art where lettering, design and a kind of flatness, if you sense, which signified modernism, kind of came together in this way. I hope that helps.
That's wonderful. Anything to add, Dan or Megan?
I think, I mean, Diane answered that beautifully. I would just add or emphasize that one key thing about Flächenkunst, the surface decoration, is the notion of cross-pollination. And basically these were designs that were unabashedly flat and radically flat, but that these two-dimensional designs could be applied to three-dimensional media like architecture or furniture. And then the furniture and architecture in turn informing the radically flat graphic design. The surface decoration, the Flächenkunst on the buildings is a wonderful example. How the design of the Secession's facade is reflected and was a reflection of the pages of Versachem. I mean, if this Flächenkunst idea is something that really interests you, there's an amazing article by the Secessionist critic Ludwig Hevesi on the notion of Flächenkunst in the paintings of Klimt's. And he basically likens Flächenkunst, I think he really gets it, to sort of looking through a kaleidoscope, and the pieces in a kaleidoscope, like a mosaic, could be rearranged indefinitely. And this sort of kaleidoscope notion, which you see so well in the Flächenkunst backdrops of Gustav Klimt, whether it's his apple trees or the later portraits, which show the same sort of primitivizing currents as many of the women were attracted to, whether folk art, you see toys in the background, and of course, East Asian textiles. So I don't want to add much more.
I think that's, if I may just say, that's a really important point, because what these flattened forms, playing with kind of the blank space of the page or the surface of whatever it was, made I mean, Colin and Moser was a real progenitor of this, the way in which these flattened patterns transferred so brilliantly from the page to building the fascia of a building, to textiles, of course, as well, and ultimately to fashion too. And in fact, you know, one of the most famous, well, best known textile companies did actually, in fact, take Colin and Moser designs and turn them into the most beautiful textiles, which most of the designs originated as graphic art. And in fact, they still do produce his textiles, which are still sold in Vienna.
That's so fascinating. Yeah, one of the things that this conversation makes me think of is also in all three of your essays, the tools of design kind of come to the foreground in interesting ways. You have this surface art on the one hand, but then this language that I think even shows up in one of the essays in Die Fläche of the language of the materials out of which a thing is made. And I think that Larisch uses that language too in his manuals. So I wonder if there's anything to say about the relationship between these two things, the kinds of tools that they were reaching for, the Quellstift, the stencil, the woodcut, and a different kind of drawing, and this notion of Flächenkunst. Maybe the answer is just yes.
But I think one of us now. I think that part of the idea, certainly in lettering at this time, is to pick the tool that will allow the most expressive form of the message at hand. So I don't think that Larisch, for instance, taught students how to write with a Quellstift because he thought that letters formed with a Quellstift are the most ornamental kind of letters that he could imagine. It's rather a tool that was different from what students had been using to write daily life text before, and would force them to rethink about what it was they're doing and why they were doing it. And some of the debates around drawing at this time, I think it also applies to, you know, what are you trying to get? Like, what is the desired effect? How can you create that? And whatever means that you use to be able to achieve that end result are the right means, and not a brush and oil paint, because 20 years ago, great work had been made by artists with brushes and oil paints.
Are there any other thoughts on that? If not, I have a question about education and links up with. Yeah, so another thing that all three of your papers delve quite deeply into and was very new to me was this kind of secessionist takeover at the Applied Arts School and the kinds of pretty radical shifts in what was kind of developing into what we know as design education was happening at the hands of the secessionists. And there's a question in the chat about the Bauhaus, and we generally think of this kind of revolution in design education as kind of happening a little bit later on, in the 1920s at the Bauhaus. And this question asks if there are any kind of resonances or connections between what's happening, I guess, also not just in design education, but in design in Vienna 1900 and what later happens in the Bauhaus, or how do we situate this this earlier shift?
I think from the little bit that Megan's just said, she's got some details on this that I don't have. But one of the thematic principles that get picked up after the war at the Bauhaus, again, goes back to this concept, this incredibly strong concept of this unification of the arts, which was absolutely kind of taken. I mean, it wasn't just sort of, it's not just been written about afterwards about the way in which art developed, these graphic arts developed, and the sort of unified arts of the Wiener Werkstätte, houses and apartments and all the rest of it. It wasn't just something that we've overlaid as art historians looking back at a particular period, but it was actively described not only, for example, by Ludwig Hevethi and other followers of the secession at the time, but the secessionists, also the secessionists themselves, in their materials that they were using for exhibitions and various other ways of explaining or describing what they were aiming to, a kind of concept that was both utopian in its ideas, that design obviously would transform the world, if you like, or the art had this transformative notion, but also the unified arts in the graphic arts, taking lettering and the surface of the page and this kind of flattening of the surface, which is very much linked to modernism, was about this notion of the total work of art or unified work of art. And that was very much written in to the early manifesto of the Bauhaus in when it was first founded in Weimar in the immediate post-war period. That's my contribution.
I would love to answer this question. That's such a great question. I discuss it in my book, The Female Secession. So on the question of connections between secessionist Vienna and the Bauhaus, you can look at this in two ways, direct connection and parallels. And in both ways, it's strong. So Johannes Innen, the famed master at the Bauhaus, the leader of the celebrated Vorkurs, the preparatory course, he operated a private art school in Vienna. He was a former kindergarten teacher, as you know, and this private art school was around from 1916 to 1919. When he left to accept the position in Weimar, there were a core group of students that followed him. It was about 15 students or so. Some of them are well known. Many of these were Jewish with social democratic leanings. They were very much talked about at the Bauhaus. And among these were artists like Friedel Dicker-Brandeis, who was an artist, designer. Her last, she taught children's art. She taught children at Theresienstadt, very much a tragedy and a heroic thing, and also her partner, Franz Singer. So, he was operating in Vienna. He then went to Weimar, of course. Perhaps the more interesting question is the parallels. So the figure that I mentioned, Franz Zizek, so he was renowned because he was one of probably the first educator to not teach children in a prescriptive way. He allowed them to draw from their imaginations. They were encouraged to release inner feelings through free choice of handcraft media. And of course, he did not correct their mistakes. There was some limitations to their creativity, but it was wildly permissive for the time. So that attitude of free expressivity obviously paralleled and overlapped with Cizek, overlapped with Itten. And Cizek was not the only Viennese art educator to espouse those feelings. On the contrary, it encompassed other Klimt group members like Adolf Böhm, Josef Hoffmann, Coleman Moser. Essentially, most of the secessionists who took over the School of Applied Arts used these methods similar to Itten's to various degrees, and also embraced this sort of ludic atmosphere of experimentation. There are the famous images of Mirbach designing with the students. And incidentally, the head of the Kunstgewerbeschule, Mirbach, was a great proponent of Cizek. He not only supported Cizek's classes and reforms, personally came to them to observe them. He got Cizek installed with an official position as inspector of drawing. So he was actually able to bring these reforms into the actual classroom of official primary schools. So in any case, this notion of progressive educational developments in Vienna before the Bauhaus is a very important thematic question.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm
yeah,
going to come in on this because I agree entirely with what Diane and Megan said. It applies to every field, I think, I can imagine in the Bauhaus except lettering. In many ways, the Bauhaus members were intentionally iconoclastic. And they had Larisch's manual on lettering in their school library. It had they inherited the library from the Applied Arts School in Vienna, and the book stayed in or the Applied Arts School in Weimar, and the book stayed in Weimar after the Bauhaus left Weimar for Dessau. But the lettering that is made at the Bauhaus is generally drawn and not written. So the manual process of writing and bringing your own expression into the letter forms is something that what I'm sure was practiced in the initial years at the Bauhaus, but after 1923 was intentionally replaced, or at least that they would attempt to replace it with constructed letter forms that they viewed as universal. And when you read Moholy-Nagy's writings on the new typography and Schickel's writings on the new typography, they wanted engineered lettering and typography, and not this. It's not the same thing that Larisch was a proponent of.
Yeah, thank you. That's such an important point. And Lucy mentioned that we're working on this book about Pete Svart's catalog for NKF, and we're also translating one of Svart's essays on the new typography. And one of Larisch's lines was about brutal legibility as being something to avoid, something, you wouldn't want to just, force brutal legibility on your viewers. And Svart picks this line up and advocates for it in his essay. This is what the new typography is: brutally legible. So yeah, interesting connection and distinction at that moment. So we're rounding the bend on our time. We have about 6 minutes left. There's a question in the chat about how this was printed, which I think we could answer quickly, but it sort of opens onto a broader question, which I kind of wanted to pose to everyone about how this material circulated or didn't, because this is kind of, when I started looking at this thing, like, it felt very weird and felt very new and something that I hadn't seen before. And as Diane was saying, like, there's still kind of more presence in the literature around Versacrum as the sort of catalog, the publication of the secession, than Die Fläche. So how do we think about how the ideas, the visuals, the artists that we see depicted in Die Fläche, how they circulated or didn't, and are now just being seen in the way that Megan talked about it. And I wanted to share really quickly, as I was doing research for this, the the visuals of Die Fläche started showing up all over in these kinds of unexpected places. So here's artwork by Elsa Lott that Megan showed us, and someone in the chat mentioned that this ink company, Alten Viberg, reproduced without credit some pages, actually something like 39 of the pages from Die Fläche as inserts for print marketing catalogs in the early 20th century. So you see that here with radically different lettering than you might expect from Die Fläche artists at the time. On the left, there's an article about this image being plagiarized in 1904 already, and then two instances, one from the UK and one from Japan, of this image being used as decoration for sheet music. So yeah, this is just kind of by way of opening a larger question of like, how did this stuff make its way into the world if it did? What do we do with this weird publication that is now available kind of for the first time for lots of people to see?
I mean, can I just say that I think well, obviously I can't speak for Megan and Dan, but well, I can, because we've all said the same thing. I mean, it's very difficult to work out where Die Fläche was circulated. I guess that's what you're saying. But there's no doubt in my mind, from having spent hours and hours and hours with it and looked again at the context in which all of this was happening, that the students that were, I mean, a lot of them, we think of, when we think of students, we think of 16 to 18-year-olds, but a lot of the students or the pupils or whatever we want to call them at the Kunstgewerbeschule were older anyway. And it seems to me that there was a kind of clear line between the secession and the Kunstgewerbeschule and this kind of encouragement to work on designs and graphic art which were intended intentionally for the commercial world. I don't know quite how they got into the commercial world, and that little thing you've just shown us there, Chris, is really fascinating. But that was the intention. And certainly a lot of artists, well, again, it's difficult to track them because the post-war period in Austria was so very different and shaped in so many different ways, socially and politically, than the pre-war period. But there's no doubt in my mind that these students, that these practitioners, let's call them practitioners, this was a really radical way of fitting the kind of ideas, and in a very short, condensed period of time, of fitting these graphic ideas and applying them to commercial opportunities, if you like, or commercial applications. And that's the direction they were moving in. It is really difficult to track where they ended up, because also, as far as I can tell, from the research that I did in that earlier period around 1900, there wasn't really the kind of great, there's very little archival material, or at least there wasn't when I was looking at in the V Museum and all over the place, for photographic imagery of posters that appeared more generally as publicity in Vienna. Whereas if you look at Paris and photograph, there's a huge resource of stuff that, we can see how important publicité was in Paris. But there's no doubt, looking at the kind of subject matter that they were working on, and the fact that they were actually designing some of these, particularly some of these extraordinary images of the modernist woman, the sort of strong modernist woman, that they were being applied to companies and brands, if you like. So I think this kind of professionalization of the graphic arts in this very condensed period of time was something that they were moving forward with. That's as far as I can go.
Yeah, thank you. And that's actually as far as we can go. We're rounding on 1:30. So I really want to thank all three of our panelists today. What an incredibly rich series of essays and presentations. It's been a real pleasure. I've learned so much working with you all. So yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for everyone who attended, and hope you have a wonderful Thursday, everyone.